So this is our first lower body training video on the channel. Before we get started, I'm going to ask if you find the information in this video valuable, send it to somebody you think could get some use out of it. But now let's just jump into it. Squatting has always been problematic for me. Even when I was a kid sitting cross-legged, I remember just pain in my back. And to be perfectly blunt, a below parallel squat is simply a competition standard. That is not a functional goal. That is not a necessary range of motion. It's a competition standard for a competitive squat movement. So when I'm talking about squats on here, I'm not talking about below parallel range of motion. I am talking about good rotation at the hip joint, forcing my muscles to be load bearing rather than my joints or my back. So right here, this is just one of my normal squat sets, kind of a warm-up set. I'm just feeling how stiff my hips are, if I need to do a little bit more stretching, and exactly what my biggest problem area for the day is going to be. I think I did a little warm-up set of 10 here. So right down here, the time is probably blocking that out if that's coming up on here, but that toe there, I don't want that lifting up as much. Right there, that's no good. That I want to find my pinky toes in the squat. I want to be keeping my knees in line with my ankle, and so my mobility goal is to get my feet a little bit wider so that I'm not losing my footing so much. But I think when I go heavier, I correct that a little bit. But that's just my right hip is a major issue for me. So really the end range of motion is gonna be right there. And so to finish the squat, basically what I need to make sure is happening is a slight rotation at the hip joint. And so even, my joints are as flexed as they kind of need to be to engage the muscle, but we're looking for glutes and some of those more extreme muscles. So driving the knees out, forcing the hips to rotate externally while then having a slight internal rotation is basically how we sit into the hips in the squat. And if we're not getting a good hip rotation, chances are you got a butt wink, your low back is rounding, and I'm going to kind of talk about that more with my deadlifts next week. So I did working sets of three sets of 3 reps at my working weight here. I don't remember what this bar weighs, but I'm not really worried about the weight. Usually I look for 3 things when I squat: keep my brace, keep my back straight, and have a consistent range of motion with my hips, particularly that rotation we were just talking about. And that's the biggest thing I struggle with. So rather than going for a 1 rep max, I think a back squat is the dumbest thing to do a 1 rep max with. I usually go 3 to 5 rep maxes just because I want to make sure I'm staying consistent with my range of motion. So that's kind of what I'm going to look at here. So making sure my back stays straight. I'm able to get a decent rotation of the hips, get a pretty decent depth. So I don't really have much to complain about with that. My squats felt really good. My hip in particular felt really good. One thing I did, my brace pressing into my belt, that was probably the toughest thing for me that day. So that's really what I was focusing on there. Now, if your hips are not internally rotating at your squat, there are a couple things you can do for that, but chances are one of the major culprits is a overdeveloped psoas muscle. So this muscle connects just below the hip joint on the femur, and will pull on a lot of those lumbar spine if your back gets into a kind of overly extended position. And I'm going to show you one spot where I see people accidentally really overuse this muscle a lot and probably make their squats way harder than they should be. So right here we have a prone hamstring curl, and ideally we just want to use the hamstrings here to curl that weight up, reset the position. But what you're going to see is a tendency to really overuse my back. So right there, you can just imagine those muscles connecting to the femur right here and pulling all along that back. And so as I'm pulling down on this and my hips kind of tilt forward, that's just putting stress on those low back muscles. So if my hips are not staying stationary and my hips move too much when I'm doing this movement, you're gonna feel a lot of that stress unload from the hamstrings and then transition to the low back. And so really what we want to do is make sure you're keeping that exercise isolated and that your hamstrings are the only things working, with your glutes as a support rather than your psoas muscle. And so right here, I'm focusing on squeezing my butt cheeks and keeping my glutes tight as much as I can while I'm only using my hamstrings and not my back muscle. You see my hips are raising up, but that's just kind of my quads actually sort of mechanically pushing my legs up. So don't get mixed up between the hips rising and the hips tilting. That tilt is really the biggest concern for us. So just make sure we're not leaning into that too much. If you have any questions, contact me through social media, leave a comment on the video. If this video was beneficial to you, share it around. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more content coming out on a weekly basis. I'll see you on Upper Body Day, and until then, drink tons of water, stay safe, and stay healthy.